Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this ICAS webinar on Discover the Future of Accountancy Insights from UK Society and our members. My name is Marie Gardner. I'm the Head of Research at ICAS, and I have the pleasure of being your host today. This is a very exciting day today, actually, because it marks the publication of our brand new extensive research. By way of a little background and context, today's webinar and associated research inscribe themselves in the wider context of an ambitious and proactive ICAS initiative called Shaping the Profession, which we affectionately refer to as STP. STP explores the future of the accountancy profession at a time of huge economic and societal change, with the aim of ensuring professional accountants have the skills, the support, and ethical grounding needed to balance commercial realities with their duty to serve society, and for a profession for the future that remains relevant, trusted, and aligned with societal needs. Briefly, the STP program is organized along 5 key themes, which you can see in the slide in front of you. Societal needs, the first theme, which we are focusing on today. Theme 2, What is a Professional, looks at defining what a 21st century professional should look like. Theme 3, The Impact of Technology and AI, is looking at how tech is redefining the accountant's role. Theme 4, Building an Exciting and Fit for Purpose Profession for Future Generations, is about equipping future accountants with the relevant skills, capabilities, and knowledge. And least but by no means last, the last theme is theme 5, regulation, which is about exploring how proportionate regulation can keep up with change, but also become an enabler of positive change. So with the context being set, let me introduce our panelists. For today's webinar, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our speakers and experts, James Baird and Fran van Dijk. James is a former auditor with nearly 40 years experience. James has led Deloitte in Scotland and then led Deloitte's audit and advisory business in Switzerland. He now holds a number of non-executive director roles and is Professor of Practice in Accounting and Finance at Glasgow University, as well as chair of the ICAS STP steering group and of the research panel at ICAS. So busy man, by all accounts. And Fran is founder of One Stone Advisors Limited, a global strategy and communications team which helps companies become more successful sustainability leaders. One Stone is a founding B Corp with clients including Agreco, Carlsberg Group, Tetra Pak, and TUI Travel. Fran is public interest member on sustainability for ICAS. Before we begin with the conversation, just a few housekeeping matters to remind you of. You can submit your questions, and we encourage you to submit your questions anonymously at any time through the Q&A facility, which you can access at the top of your screen. We will be saving your questions until the end of the webinar for a live Q&A. Please also join the conversation today through the chat box, which can also be accessed at the top of your screen. We are recording this webinar and we will make it available for on-demand viewing afterwards in case you want to refer back to it. But there's a lot to cover this afternoon. And before we get to the Q&A, Fran, James and I will spend the first 30 minutes or so discussing some of the key findings from our research. I mentioned and I outlined the 5 key areas for the STP program, with the first one and the cornerstone of the whole program being understanding societal needs from the accountancy profession, which is precisely what this webinar is focusing on. The research leading us to today combine 8 public focus groups and a survey of more than 1,000 UK citizens, with an additional survey and discussion sessions with our ICAS members across 4 UK regions. And this was all in order to capture a cross-section of both public and professional perspectives from a variety of demographics. And without further ado, let's drill into the crux of the matter. And as a first question to you, James, it is worth providing some context and clarifying what we mean by societal needs here. James.
Yes, thanks very much, and good afternoon, everybody. So I think an important point to say up front is that shaping the profession, we were determined to listen to as many people as possible and to understand their views. It was never about ICAS determining its own approach to things. And so the aspect of listening was very important. Behind ICAS's very existence is the Royal Charter, and ICAS was granted chartered status in 1854. And that's very important to the status of ICAS, but to the status of all chartered accountants. It allows us to describe ourselves as chartered. And many people would consider it also as part of being a professional, that constitutes more than serving your own interest. It has an element of public interest behind it. So the public interest is absolutely critical to what ICAS does and what it should be doing in the future. But the question then becomes, what is the public interest? Who are the public and what are they interested in? And very importantly, how is that changing? Because, going right the way back to 1854, a lot has changed since then, and we're seeing a lot changing in society at the moment, whether it be all the geopolitical changes that we're seeing that we're all very aware of, whether it be technology and artificial intelligence and automation and all the disruption that is coming through that, whether it be the economic pressures that many businesses are coping with at the moment, and importantly, and this is Fran's area in particular, sustainability and the growing concern about the impact upon the planet. Society's needs can't be assumed to be the same that they have been since 1854. So ICAS were very determined that one of the first stages of this process should be listening and then understanding what society's needs really are from as wide a group of stakeholders as possible, and then determining how we can best serve and fulfill the mission of public interest going forward.
Thank you, James. That's helped clarifying this definition for us. Fran, I know you wanted to add a little bit of a perspective, an additional perspective.
Yeah, just to kind of add another layer. I mean, one of the ways I like to think of the economy is as a wholly owned subsidiary of the planet, because we rely entirely on the planet for a healthy economy. And of course, for us to be sustainable, socially, environmentally, and economically, a really good idea is to keep the planet in a very, very good shape. And I think that topic will come up quite a lot during the discussion today, because at the moment, certainly the environmental risks that the planet is carrying mean a lot for business, and the role for accountants in helping to measure, highlight, and take note of and record those risks is incredibly important and growing. And I think we're going to touch on that a few times during our discussion today.
Thank you, Fran. So now drilling into the actual findings from my research. So trust emerged as a central theme, not surprisingly. James, I will ask you the first questions. How is trust currently perceived within the profession, and what can be done to strengthen that trust?
I think there are a number of key messages that come from this slide, and perhaps a little bit of additional explanation. That the views that ICAS sought encompass people who are described as active and actively engaged in the profession. So those who work as accountants in whatever capacity, but equally passive people. So people who are not active in the profession, but who may rely upon it. They may not actually declare an active interest in the profession and may rely upon somebody else doing what they need. So we split the results between active engagement and stakeholders and passive engagement and stakeholders. And I think the message that comes through clearly from this slide is that the level of trust that is reported across the people that were interviewed or surveyed is pretty high. At 78% for those who are actively either working in or engaged with the profession, that's a pretty high percentage of trust. But we then have to look at the 58% of passive stakeholders, which again you know, it's over the 50%, but one might challenge, and I guess, you know, we want to be asking those difficult questions of ourselves for a profession which is focused upon the public interest, and therefore trust is a major value that we have at the core of what we do. Is 58% among passive stakeholders something that we should be happy with? If I go back to the total percentage, that's 66%, so totaling across the active and passive, you have 28% who are neutral, who don't really associate it or have a particular view on trust. And again, I would call that out as, for a profession where trust appears to be really pretty critical to what we promise to do for society, is 28% of people not really caring or having a view on trust, is that not a challenge for us? The other thing I would call out on this slide, which I think is very interesting, is on the right-hand slide, you know, what is trust built upon? And very clearly what comes through is that it's built upon experience or expertise, and both of those are important. And that's critical in an era when, if expertise is just built on knowledge, well, one can rely upon ChatGPT or Google in order to get knowledge, but experience is also highly valued. But underneath that, there are also three emotional drivers that our stakeholders actually expect: unfiltered honesty. They expect the professional to have the best interest at heart, and they expect an aspect of understanding and empathy. And I think there are some challenges there regarding how the profession engages with its stakeholders going forward and communicates with them.
Thank you, James. Fran, being the public interest member for ICAS Council, with the prism of sustainability and looking after the interests of future generations, if you like, is there something else from what James has outlined that you would like to pick up on, particularly in terms of sharing any public concerns?
I think that James has done a really good job of unpicking that slide, and I think perhaps one of the things for the general public working with the accountancy profession is requiring some slightly clearer communication, because it can be quite technical, to make sure that people are really transparent. I think ethical behaviour from individual accountants is kind of assumed. It's a very highly regarded profession, but what one could do a bit more of is to really underpin that culture of integrity. In other words, the role of the accountant connecting to society and communicating that, so as a body rather than just as individuals. You mentioned, James, the understand me. That means understanding all your stakeholders. And that would also mean, if you're going to show two-way communication and some empathy, it means thinking a little bit harder about standing in the shoes, stepping into the shoes of the people that you're serving, and try to understand where they're coming from. Because working with accountants, can be quite confusing for the person in the street. It's quite mystical and mystifying. And I think we're going to come on to that a little bit later.
Thank you, Fran. Staying with you, actually, the second theme that came clearly as part of our research, and we actually asked, what is the perception of accountancy? So if you don't mind, let's explore with you what those perceptions are and how our research showed accountants are viewed generally.
Yeah, and first of all, hats off to ICAS for asking this question. I think it's a really leading thing to be doing, to be seeking the outside world's opinion about you in this way. And as you can see from the quote on the left, this mystical image does prevail. There's a lack of understanding from your person in the street on what accountants actually do. People do find the profession a little bit inaccessible. Perhaps the charter makes it sound a bit more distant than it really is. And 50% of UK society doesn't really understand what accountants do day to day. So there are some barriers there. It's a complex role, and perhaps accountants could think a little bit more about, so how do we simplify what we do? How do we talk about it in very simple terms, strip out as much jargon as we possibly can, be very clear in communication, friendly, use simplified language, and try to not just articulate but demonstrate how the profession adds value to society. And it really does. You know, we know that good accountants help people in their businesses, in their personal lives, and to help prepare for future generations as well. So one of the key things there, and it links back to the empathy idea, is learning to ask really good questions of the people you're serving so that you know that you're providing what they need.
Thank you, Fran. James, we, as part of your introduction and your bio, so we see that you have had a very extensive career in practice. So I'd be interested in your reaction from the practice and the profession perspective as to what Fran has just outlined.
Yeah, I tie in completely with what Fran said. Whether it be more years than I would like to count for of experience in practice, or since then I'm a chair of an audit committee of a PLC and a chair of a charity and so on. Across all of those, I'm sometimes surprised by how mystifying people find accounting. There is a tendency to sort of say, "Oh gosh, it's accounting. You know, somebody else should deal with that," and that has helped us as a profession effectively have a distinctive role. But I think we've got to be very careful not to rely upon that. Knowledge and the way that people acquire knowledge and can use it is changing massively with automation and ChatGPT and other AI type models. It's much easier to get knowledge. And any of us with those kind of technically mystifying terminology, we can just type it in and get that deciphered and get illustrative examples. So the profession is going to see some of that mystification break down. Some of that complexity is going to break down. And I think the profession, as Fran has highlighted, needs to do a better job of actually translating what it does and the experience and expertise it has into the positive use cases and the positive examples of what it has done. I remember in many years of public practice training, some of the most meaningful training I had was going through instances of frauds or scandals that had happened and breaking them down and actually working out what went wrong and why. But as a profession, we tend to try and not talk about these things too much. We almost deliberately keep the black box closed. And perhaps it's part of what we think makes us special, that we look after this closed black box of knowledge. But we really have to open that up and be much more forthcoming about the benefit that we are delivering to society and why that is relevant and why that is important going forward. And it's on us to do.
Yeah. Thank you for this. And you're quite rightly about this whole onus on the profession and on professional accountants to open up that black box and to demystify what we do and demonstrate what value we add to society is one aspect of it. If we're looking at the future of the profession, we've done that bit, the explaining, if you like, then what the societal needs research is looking at is what is it that we actually need to fulfill in terms of needs. And to do that, we went to our respondents and our focus group participants and we asked them, if you were to imagine your life in 15 years from now, and if I was asking you to think about the challenges you may face, we wanted to know what concerns they would highlight, which then accountants would fill in terms of delivering against those needs. Fran, if I turn to you, can I ask you what the key concerns were highlighted from the public?
Yes, and the main thing that was highlighted by some margin was the household finances part being a major concern, and that's not too much of a surprise. We hear that on the news on a regular basis, don't we? Cost of living, inflation, all of these things are very troubling to people in terms of running their households, and they're very concerned about the future. one of the interesting things that I think accountants should really think about and be aware of, it's obviously very, very clear to you what the difference is between a financial advisor and an accountant, but you'd be amazed how many people out there are confused about that. So they don't have very much financial literacy. So this whole area is a bit mystical, which is the word used previously to them, and also kind of porridge, mixed up. And another role that accountants can play is help to clarify that, to say, okay, well, here's how we can help you. And typically for most people, that would be for tax and their accounts, and quite often through their businesses rather than their personal lives. Whereas a financial advisor would be doing a different job. But both those professions can help with financial literacy. I just want to draw out a little bit further into the future, because you'll see that a lot of people are concerned about planning, 40%. And they're thinking about pensions, they're thinking about having money available for the future, or perhaps even, as reference on the side here, coping with the financial unpredictability. And as a little side note, I answered a government survey yesterday, and one of the questions there, it was for the statistical report that they'll be doing, was, if you had an unexpected cost of £850, would you be able to pay it? And that's quite concentrates the mind. If you think that that sum for quite a few people obviously is not payable in the short term. So when you're thinking about the general public, those are the kinds of sums we're needing to take account of. Longer term, of course, I mentioned earlier that we are going to be looking at sustainability risks later. There's going to be much more disruption due to climate change. We're going to see flooding, we're going to see building damage, we're going to see more heat and therefore more illness. We're going to see food prices going up. And so there's a link there, I think, for accountants to recognise that these concerns that we have here on the slide are likely to get bigger rather than smaller.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And that links to the empathy. The accountant needed to understand what the key challenges faced by their clients or the wider stakeholders are, but also picking up on the point you made about confusion between what an accountant does and what a financial advisor may do. Is leading them to the right solution. And therefore, staving off some potential criticism because we're not addressing, for example, managing household finances. So it's the right horses or the right courses. James, in turn, we obviously ask that similar questions from the professional perspective, i.e., what do they believe the pain points and challenges from a professional angle are? Could I pass over to you to expand on that, please?
Sure. And I think that probably the first thing to say is that to some extent, separating it into two different worlds of the individual versus organizations and businesses is a bit artificial, because every business and every organization is made up of a whole group of individuals, and in effect they all have their own private interests, their own private concerns and personal risks, very much along the lines that Fran was outlining. But if we then come on and think about what challenges accountants face in respect of organisations and businesses, there were some very clear messages that came through, which you can see on this slide. 57% actually said that one of the biggest challenges is staying relevant. And I think that comes back to a couple of things. One, all of those disruptive risks and all of those major transformational changes that we are seeing that we referenced right at the start of this session. But secondly, the changes which are being experienced in the world of accountancy. So I mentioned right at the start automation and the power of artificial intelligence. The people we spoke to were highlighting self-serve accounting systems like QuickBooks or Xero, that if we went back 30, 40 years, it was probably a major part of what many accountants did, was actually bring that expertise to a company or a business. Well, now those businesses are self-serving and doing it for themselves using technology. So staying relevant was seen as the biggest challenge. 41% actually said that, yes, one of our challenges is trying to, and it's back to the mystification point, trying to break down and open up what we actually do. In other words, trying to communicate and articulate the value of what we can deliver. The surveys and interviews did touch upon the thorny point around the criticism of the profession, and 36% said that one of the challenges at a business or organizational level was the negative public perception that comes from financial scandals and the perception that accountants either were part of creating those circumstances or failed to advise and forewarn of those. I think we would all probably appreciate that you can do a lot to build and communicate the value of what you do, and that is diminished and diluted and destroyed very, very quickly when there is a scandal and a particular professional activity such as accounting is perceived to be at fault or deficient. I think that one of the other major messages for me here behind this slide was that within the feedback, most accountants, so about 55% of accountants, believed that recognizing those challenges, the profession should focus on its core roles of financial management, assurance, and reporting. And I think that's interesting. And it's something which we need to challenge ourselves on, that if we're facing all of these changes and all of these challenges and all of these disruptions, is it really enough to focus just on what we have been doing? Surely, as a minimum, we need to recognize that what we have been doing, or many aspects of it, are going to fundamentally change with technology and automation, which brings you back to the 57%. And maybe we need to think about what else should the profession be doing going forward to remain relevant and to remain valued.
Thank you, James. I know we are keeping the questions for after our presentation, but there's a comment in the chat which I think is an interesting one to pick up, particularly in this section. And I'll open that to you, or James or Fran. So it's a commentary, but the ending comment is the breadth of activities accountants can be involved is often not well understood outside the profession. And I think that's true. So when we were talking earlier about, people are confused between what a financial advisor and an accountant do, and I was saying you need to guide them to the right solution. I think often people do not see the number of solutions that the accountancy profession can deliver.
And if I say a quick comment on that, I think there's two things. One, that's about opening up that black box and the profession learning, and I will say it's at that stage, learning how to be much more open and much more proactively communicating what it does. But I think the other angle is that for many businesses, an accountant is in effect a portal across a whole range of different sources of advice that may not come from the accountant themselves, but they will then introduce the lawyer or the advisor or the M&A specialist or the valuation specialist or the tax specialist. And it is the accountant as that kind of trusted advisor to a business organization that is a major part of the role. And so we're challenged by the complexity and the breadth, but it's also an opportunity for us to actually bring greater relevance to the companies and the people that we work with, as long as we have that open advisory perspective.
Thank you. I love the word you just used, portal. So I think back of, and that's really appropriate, I think. But I think back of when we first look at the results from the research, when the word demystifying came up, the profession is quite mystical. And the image that popped to our minds as we were reading it is a bit of a Harry Potter world. But now with using portal, it's a bit of a Star Trek world. So I think we need to decide where we're going to position ourselves. Or maybe we just, use both analogies to help people. Fran, is there anything you wanted to add into that, that breadth of roles from the accountants, or as James covered it?
I think James has pretty much covered it, and we're coming to it, I think, in the next slide when we're looking at the future, because I do think that the role of accountants has enormous potential as we go to a more data-driven world.
Yeah, thank you, Fran, and I will move on nicely. So the next set of questions we ask respondents, so we ask them, about trust. What is the foundation of trust? We ask them, how do you perceive accountants? We ask them, what are your pain points and challenges, whether it's from the individual perspectives or the practice, business perspective. And then we ask them, well, having understood all of this, where do you think that leaves the future of accountancy? And essentially, I'm going to come back to you, James, and what do you think, well, not what you think, already, but could you expand on what the accountants told us they believe the future looked like for accountancy?
Yeah, I think it's reassuring that there was a high percentage who identified AI and technology. And I don't say that because I'm in some way an evangelist of artificial intelligence and technology, but I think it shows that the accountants and the stakeholders that we spoke to recognize the scale of opportunity and the scale of challenge that comes with the developments in technology and AI. And that is something which, if we go back to the themes of shaping the profession that you outlined at the start, Marie, that we've identified ourselves within ICAS, and such that we have identified a specific theme of work around the opportunities and challenges of technology and AI, ranging from what is it going to make obsolete, and therefore, we may have relied upon it as accountants as being part of the services we deliver, but it's actually going to be automated and disappear, through to how is technology going to augment and improve our ability to serve our clients and our stakeholders, right through to what are the new areas that we perhaps don't even know about yet, which society is going to look to accountants to actually help them with. And one of the key areas or the key perspectives that the people we interviewed and surveyed came up with in respect of AI and technology was interesting, and it was the ability of accountants to act as advisors, explainers, interpreters, facilitators. And yes, there will be some accountants who will become technology specialists, but it was also recognized that a major part of what the profession will do is be, if you like, a mediator for artificial intelligence technology, to help people make the most of that opportunity and to manage the risks and challenges that come with it. And that comes back, I think, to that importance of trust, in that to be seen as a trusted mediator and a trusted advisor, we will need to understand not just the technology, but also our stakeholders and our clients in terms of what they can do or should do, and what they want to do with that kind of technology. So technology is certainly in there. I'll perhaps leave sustainability reporting, which and ESG type matters, which I think is a huge consideration, but I'll leave that perhaps for Fran to comment on. I think what also came out very strongly, and perhaps sits behind this slide, is 68% of the people we surveyed and interviewed referred to SME support and the importance of the role of accountants in dealing with SMEs and their owners or stakeholders. And given the importance and the centrality of SMEs to the economy, both in Scotland and in the UK, that's, I think, an important message. It may well be that in the future, accountants are using that AI and technology or advising on sustainability reporting or data analytics has come through this. But it's important to recognize that it won't just be the biggest organizations. It'll be also that very important population of SMEs.
Thank you, James. Fran, do you want to come in on the point of sustainability that James alluded to?
Yes, and let's break that down a little bit, because when we talk about sustainability, we normally talk about, society, the economy and the environment. So there's sort of three legs, and if we're talking about ESG, governance comes into it as well, which is incredibly important, because quite often, there's going to be a CFO on the board, and in future that CFO is likely to be responsible for sustainability information. So there will be a powerful person with decision-making responsibilities at the highest possible level, working to ensure that sustainability information is accurate. Already, obviously, accountants are assuring sustainability reports, but it tends to be in quite a general way. Certain data points are confirmed as being accurate and true, but now what is going to happen with carbon reporting is there's going to be a huge amount of data that will be required to be reported on in a lot more detail. And that is a huge opportunity, of course, for the accounting profession and the assurance profession. Equally, nature is going to be coming onto the scene in a big way. The Task Force on Nature, TNFD, nature-related financial disclosures, is echoing the Task Force on Nature-related climate disclosures. And so those data points are being clarified and discussed now and will need to be reported on by large companies. And I think a second point here for the profession is that most of that risk is in the supply chain. Nearly, think of all the companies that are actually reliant on nature, any food company, any cosmetics company, any building company, they will have a lot of nature risk in their supply chain and a lot of carbon risk in their supply chain. So the length, if you like, of the lengths you have to go to collect and assure data from all those suppliers is very detailed, very time consuming, and it's very important to get it right. So I see a lot of work there, possibly some risk for the profession if they don't do it right, but an awful lot of work and an awful lot of opportunity for the accounting profession to have a massive influence on sustainability documentation, measurement and reporting going forward.
Thank you, Fran. And I would add on closing on that particular slide that the 54%, 70% were actually not surprises, but it was good to actually get that validated from actual empirical evidence. So we had evidence to support where we think the profession is going in that regard. I suppose one thing to say is obviously, we have covered the tip of the iceberg with what we've showed you today. And the idea was to give you snippets of information to hopefully make you want to find out more, because there's a lot more findings that we have. And we've also extrapolated from findings to implications and recommendations as to what we feel as a professional body, we need to do next as a profession, both as a body, but also for the members within the profession as we deliver to society. So I'm really thankful to you two, James and Fran, for helping me, bring this research to life. We're about to go into the Q&A, but before we move on to this, and actually I can see that the Q&A is empty at the moment, but there are a few comments in the chat. So we'll not go to the Q&A, we'll go to the chat in a second. But before we move to that, it would be really great if our attendees could leave us a rating for today's webinar so far. There will be a poll appearing on your screens in a second, or in the chat box at the top of your screen. And we really appreciate your feedback. So please take a few moments to respond, and then we will jump onto the Q&A or the chat. And that's me hoping the poll will appear. I'll give it another second. Oh, here we go. So all you have to do is click on the stars. Wonderful. So let's move on to the Q&A. So I'm going to go to the chat just now. I did notice, as I mentioned, a few comments. So I will not read out the names of the people, but you have access to the chat yourself, so you can see. Somebody mentioned part of the issue, so we're talking about perceptions here and potentially as well the misunderstanding of the role. Part of the issue would still appear to be the extent to which society regards accountants as watchdogs as opposed to advisors. James, you're nodding, and that echoes some of the conversations we've had in the past, but can I maybe open that comment out to you first?
Yeah, I completely agree with Ian's comment there. But I think I think the profession has played a role in that perception. Parts of the profession have made their business around effectively saying that we will provide a comfort, provide assurance, and we should be trusted to do so. Now, if you set that out to be your purpose, the problem is that when you have a failure or a deficiency that causes a problem, people will rightly say, well, wait a minute, you asked us to rely upon what you had done. Why are you now saying that we should not have relied upon it? Or why are you saying it wasn't our job to tell you all of that? And I think sometimes, and this comes to, I do a lot of my own research in this area, it comes to the fact that the profession has, my own personal opinion is that the profession has perhaps allowed itself to be a little bit taken over by risk management, and has concentrated its communication around, particularly in the audit field, spending more time saying what it did not do, rather than saying what it did actually do. And I think that has been to the detriment of the reputation and relevance and value of audit. And many in the audit field, including the regulators, are now moving their mindset towards, yep, we perhaps actually need to start focusing more on what are the objectives or outcomes of what we are trying to achieve, rather than what are we trying to stop. But I think it goes beyond that. If you go to any company or business, they will have information and they will be making decisions and they will be asking people to trust in the information they produce, and they'll be making decisions based on that information. In all cases, there will be accountants and accounting knowledge that will be backing up that information. But we as accountants have not succeeded in really explaining the importance of information, the importance of measurement, the importance of trusted information, and the role of the accountant in actually delivering that trust. And we need to get much, much better at that and stop hiding behind the risk managers telling us, don't say too much. Because fundamentally, we are a profession that is looking to do something for the public good. We're looking to serve our stakeholders, and we need customers to do that. We like to hide behind the fact that they are clients, not customers. And we need to get much more open and much more forthcoming about what we do.
Thanks, James.
Marie, I've got something to add there,
Wonderful.
which I think from just being a public interest member at ICAS and being immersed in the profession for the first time quite deeply, apart from coming across assurers in my consulting work, I think what I have learned is how highly regulated you are. You know, it's a highly, highly, highly regulated profession, and so that does limit your freedom in terms of what you can say and what you can do. And I think that also inevitably does have an impact on people's perception, because you have to be very, very measured all the time. You can't be creative. In fact, it's, you know, it's seen as a slur to call someone a creative accountant. And so the difficulty there for the general public is the general public loves storytelling. And that's quite difficult to do when you are very highly regulated. It's a fine line to tread to make it interesting and to make it accurate. So it's not easy. But I hear what James is saying, but I do also appreciate how hard it is.
And that ties in very nicely when I was presenting the 5 key themes earlier, linking into theme 5, which we will focus on regulation. It's very relevant indeed. Is, you know, how do you make regulation become an enabler and not a blocker? So that really echoes on some of your commentary. Thank you for this. We have 2 more questions in the Q&A box. For all the audience, please do feel free to add them in there. We will answer as many as we can. And if there are too many, I will pick the ones which are the most relevant to the widest number of people listening today. So the next question is, with the range of activity of accountants, is the name now wrong? Because the range of activity of accountants is understated. So should we be called something else, not accountants? I don't know who wants to shout first. James.
Shall I go with that a little bit? I agree. in a horribly long period of being an accountant, I think, and I've said this to you previously, Marie, I think I've probably told people I was an accountant maybe 4 times in over 40 years. Not because I'm embarrassed by it, not because I'm, not because of the old Monty Python image of an accountant, but rather because it didn't convey to the person who was asking me what I did, what I actually did. Whether I was a company director, or whether I was a chair of a charity, or whether I was an auditor working with clients in certain industries, the term accountant never seemed adequate to actually convey what I was doing. And I do think it's a challenge for the profession. Over half of ICAS's members are not working in public practice. They're working in industry or the public sector or government. But yet, if you ask the man or woman in the street to describe the average member of ICAS, they would probably try and describe a bookkeeper, auditor, or tax advisor. And so there's a challenge for ICAS again, but also more widely for the profession, to detail the full richness of what the profession comprises, all the different types of activities, and all the different things that we do. So yes, I do agree with the sense, the question. I've also seen the add-on comment that's just appeared. It's not too late to become a lion tamer. I agree, and I still aspire to it.
Well, that's a new bow. That would be a new bow to your James. Fran, is there something you want to add in terms of the name of accountants? Is that, should we consider something about changing our name to make it clearer?
Yeah, yes, but I think my question would be, let's brainstorm what that might look like, because, advisors too general, it needs to specifically relate to what you do, and not be confused with other things. So yes, I'd love a brainstorm on that.
Excellent. Well, I suppose we could schedule one. That could be the focus of our next conversation and a webinar.
But I think in the meantime, Marie, sorry to interrupt again. I think what we need to focus upon is that those positive use cases, and Fran, you referred to storytelling. As a profession, we have not been very good at storytelling, whether it be deliberately or whether it be just it's not been within our skill set. We need to get much better at that, and getting out positive examples of how accountants of different types are actually contributing to addressing some of these big questions, whether it be sustainability or growth in the economy or integrity and efficiency in public services, whatever. There'll be accountants at the heart of all of those. But to just describe it as accounting is missing the point.
Yeah, and it goes back to the very first comment I interjected during the presentation part, where somebody had mentioned, the breadth of accountant is hidden. We are not showcasing or storytelling enough about all the various positive contributions we make, to society at large. I'll move to the next question, and I'll give you a name, Aston. Regarding challenges to the profession, what do you think is the recommended way to change the public's perception? Would it be best to hold webinars such as this one, or via different avenues? I love these questions about how do we do this? So in terms of perceptions, which we know, stereotypes, outdated, mystical, etc., how do we change that? Fran or James, who wants to shout first? Maybe Fran, because you were second on the last one.
Yeah, how do you change perceptions? They're quite deep-seated and embedded, so I think it'll take a while. I would therefore recommend starting young, and perhaps the accountancy profession could, if we're really keen to do this, start just as banks did years ago, start going into schools and explaining to younger people what it is you do, the kinds of information you analyze, the kinds of decisions you help to make through your understanding of data. And let's face it, data is going to become more and more important as we move forward. You know, it'll be there in all sorts of different arenas. And accountants are excellent at understanding data and picking out trends and the key bits of information. So I think there's very good stuff to tell there. Also, sort of building a little bit on James's point, I think storytelling is quite a moot point for accountancy, because it starts to get into that creative accounting space, and you have to be a little bit careful with language and trust. But I do think that impact is an area where one could really get some benefit. And I mean impact, not just banding around KPIs. I mean impact in the kind of traditional financial, the investment sense, the impact investment sense, which means changes made, measurable and intentional changes made due to the work that accountants do. And that, I think, could really have traction and really help people to understand how these skill sets can contribute to better society, better life, better economy, better environment.
Thank you, Fran. James, do you want to contribute as well in terms of how do we change perceptions?
I agree completely with what Fran said, especially the point around impact, that we've got to start talking about the outcomes of what we do, not the process or the regulation that guides how we do it. So impact and outcomes, I completely agree. I think I would make two additional points. One is perhaps scenarios. You know, part of good storytelling is sometimes imagine if, and let's get past the fact that people may celebrate this opening sentence, but imagine if this scenario didn't have any accounting involvement or contribution to it. And actually paint those scenarios and show how the impact or outcome would be different. I read a book some time ago on the history of measurement, and it was stunning to see that we actually only achieved consistent measurement of weights or distances and so on about 100 years ago. Before that, you know, you bought an element of measurement, and it really was subjective, and it varied massively between whoever you bought or sold it from and what country you were in. So imagine if measurement and accounting and data, measurement and data was suddenly inconsistent. People could actually, you know, in our sometimes perceived as a post-truth society, if we lost consistency around that data and information, and then we would all be relying upon information that had no integrity to it. And that would be some of the scenarios, whether it be that you were addressing sustainability, whether you were addressing growth in the economy or efficiency in public services, as I said earlier on. If you couldn't rely upon the information that was being made available to you, if you couldn't make people accountable for their performance and for their outcomes, then where would we be? So I think that importance of scenarios is maybe one. The other one I would say is that I think the change needs to happen at all levels of the pyramid. If you go to accountants, a couple of individual accountants, they'll feel it very difficult to change. There will be some things that they can change and evolve in the way that they communicate and tell the story and the way that they advise companies and organizations. But whether they're working in industry or government or whatever, they will also actually say, in order to change, I need the rules under which I work to change. So I'll need the firm within I work, or the company within which I work, or I'll need the laws and regulations to which my work is subject to. I'll need all of those to change as well. So if we're really going to change what accountancy does and how it's perceived, we actually need to change all levels of the pyramid, from regulators and standard setters, whether it be in tax or accounting or audit or whatever, insolvency. All of those will actually have to buy into that process of change, which is a huge challenge. But hey, it's good to have a good challenge, isn't it?
Always. And talking about challenge, there's an interesting comment which has just popped from Ian on the chat, and it's taking us back to the storytelling angle. And if I may, Fran, I'll ask you to react first and to respond first. So Ian mentions that he remains concerned about the potential reputational impact on the profession of taking even greater ownership for the sustainability and environmental story and audit. And the question from Ian is it taking us into far more subjective areas than those traditionally expected of us? Might it undermine the trust, is the question.
Yes, and I that's why I kind of I did raise a concern about being too creative here, because I think that is exactly what we don't want our name attached to. But I think somewhere where we can feel fairly confident is carbon at least is measurable. There's increasingly a lot of companies, well, the better companies that already have internal pricing of carbon, and they will work with that. So they're starting to understand and understand the costs of making changes to their performance to reduce carbon emissions, and also plan for the future and budget for that. There are lots of discussions about what the correct price for carbon is. It currently, in my view, and most people in my profession, far too low. Should be well over $100 a tonne, and that is yet to come. I would also say that we are working very hard on having measures for nature as well. This is much more complicated because the environmental services that nature provides are so hugely varied. Carbon is much more of a unit. So I think the concerns are correct that I wouldn't say that accountants should take on the whole of the sustainability topic, because there are parts there that are not, easily divisible into units. And there is also an emotional element there in terms of, for instance, nature and the value it brings to health and well-being. But increasingly, there are many, many more reliable units of measurement for all of these things available, which can be woven into, I believe, the accountancy profession. And the most interesting space for all of these is these connections between professions. So the connections between the sustainability professionals and the accountants, or the sustainability professionals and the financial advisors, and the accountants and the financial advisors. That is the most interesting place to be, and the most exciting place to be right now. And the other thing I would like to throw in, to James's point about measurement and noting time also was not the same in all places simultaneously, just like measuring things, actually until quite recently. But what I would encourage accountants to think about is measuring what matters, and to focus on how that could be possible to integrate into the profession. In other words, it's not just about numerical financial measures, but there are more things that matter to human beings and to businesses than just pounds, shillings and pence in old money.
Thank you, Fran. And Jim, I would have loved to, actually, I'm going to, because we're almost running out of time, but I would like to give you, 20 seconds to get your view on this part about whether taking accountancy into subjective areas is at risk of undermining trust, but only about 20 seconds. Right,
I'll do it quickly. I agree with everything that Fran said. I think it's also about those adjacencies, and things like in sustainability measurement, in the future we'll be using geospatial technology in order to measure. Will that be part of accountancy? Well, it depends whether accountancy changes to incorporate integrity over that kind of data. But I'll give you just the example that always comes back to me on trust, because Ian's question is, could that subjectivity undermine trust? when I was an auditor, the chair of the audit committee or the executive directors always used to look me in the eye and say, we've got your report, we've got your written words, but I want to look you in the eye and say, should I be happy with this conclusion? What do you think? And that is, I think, what the profession needs to continue doing, being prepared to actually voice opinions without hiding behind too much regulation and prescription.
Thank you, James, and thank you for keeping to your time. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and I wish we had more time to discuss, because there's so much more we could be talking about. As I said, that was the tip of the iceberg. All that's left for me to do is really to thank you again, Fran and James, for an engaging conversation and for being willing to share your own perspectives. What I am about to show you is how to find more information. So I mentioned there's a lot more to that research than what we've just discussed today. So if you want to read the full report, which is accessible, it's an animated report, please scan the QR code and it will take you to icast.com where the report has been published. The other thing I would like to mention to you is obviously, please remember you can keep up to date with all the latest professional news, including information, guides and resources on icast.com. And finally, but very importantly, looking ahead, you can join us on the 5th of November for the ICAS Annual Conference 2025, either in person in London or online. And the conference will provide you practical insights on AI, ethics, sustainability, which is key to evolving your role and leading with confidence, and touches on a lot of what we discussed today. That is all from me today, and thank you very much to the audience for attending and taking your time, and I hope to see you again soon.